When you were in grade school, you learned about natural resources and that water is a renewable resource. Precipitation falls to the earth, collects in rivers and streams, evaporates, and the cycle repeats. However, despite being renewable, there is a finite amount of water on the earth, and it gets recycled again and again. All of this water is part of a watershed, and no matter where you're standing on the earth, you are in a watershed.
Watershed, on its simplest terms, is when we get precipitation, whether that be rain or snow, that's going to fall within a geographic boundary. And as the rain starts to fall, one of these raindrops will eventually hit a boundary where it, at one point on one side of the boundary, it will flow one way, on another part, it will flow a different way. And that area where it all coalesces to a specific point is considered a watershed area.
Locally, ours is the Niagara River Lake Erie watershed. This includes all of Erie County and parts of Niagara, Orleans, Genesee, Wyoming, Cattaraugus, all the way down to Chautauqua County and a small piece of Allegheny County. All of the water that lands on a surface in the Niagara River Lake Erie watershed will eventually end up in Lake Erie and/or the Niagara River. The Niagara River Lake Erie watershed also contains 18 subwatersheds. Subwatersheds all drain into more localized bodies of water that eventually drain to Lake Erie. So, for example, the 18-Mile Creek is a subwatershed that drains 120 square miles of land and 274 miles of waterways. It includes parts of the towns of Hamburg, Eden, Evans, North Collins, Orchard Park, Boston, Colden, and Concord. The Niagara River Lake Erie watershed is part of a larger watershed, the Great Lakes watershed, or the Great Lakes Basin. The Great Lakes Basin drains water from 8 states and 1 Canadian province. The upstream portions of a watershed are called the headwaters. It's at that point that if water falls on one side of that border, it'll end up in one body of water. If it falls on the other side, it'll end up in another. One example of this is the Lodge Forest, located in Chautauqua County. Aside from its old-growth forest and the extensive biodiversity, it's interesting because it sits on a continental divide. So if rain falls on one side of the property, it drains to Lake Erie and the Atlantic Ocean. On the other side, it drains to the Allegheny River, the Mississippi River, and to the Gulf of Mexico. Headwater streams come together to form larger streams and rivers that flow downhill and downstream, eventually draining into a single body of water, which is what makes them all part of the same watershed. Whether rain falls from the sky and lands on a farm in Wyoming County, or snow melts on a street in Buffalo and runs down a storm drain, that runoff all makes its way to a larger body of water, in our case, Lake Erie. As it flows over a surface, it picks up whatever is on that particular surface. Oil on the street from a car, dog poop, road salt, particles of soil containing phosphorus or nitrogen from fertilizer, or chemicals from pesticides. It's a simple mathematic equation. Your water is the sum of everything within your watershed that the water flows over and distributes there. Under the Clean Water Act, stormwater is water in urbanized areas that flows over surfaces picking up pollutants that end up in our water resources. It is often monitored under a stormwater management program. The Clean Water Act also regulates runoff from large farms called Concentrated Animal Feeding Operations, or CAFOs. In unregulated areas, non-point source pollution that flows over a surface isn't regulated because there are too many variables and it is difficult to monitor. Both stormwater and non-point source pollution are major contributing factors to poor water quality, with storms and floods largely increasing the amount of pollutants entering waterways. On the contrary, point source pollution comes from an identifiable source, such as a factory, large farm, construction site, or wastewater treatment plant. It requires a state pollution discharge elimination permit, commonly referred to as a SPDIES permit. This requires monitoring and limiting the type and amount of pollutants discharged. Many of these pollutants in our watershed eventually end up in Lake Erie. Lake Erie, as well as some lakes, rivers, and streams, serve as intakes for our drinking water. The more contaminants that get into the water, the more difficult and expensive it is to treat. It's also important to mention that actions taken upstream have effects downstream. This could be anything from land use, an open field, farm, apartment complex, developed town center, to how we maintain our rivers and streams. Are they meandering with adequate floodplain, or have they been straightened with hardened sides, with stone or concrete walls? Maybe some sort of combination. Regardless, this all affects what enters our water and how it behaves downstream. The good news is that there are opportunities to use a more strategic approach when it comes to land use planning and managing our natural resources that result in cleaner water and less effort to treat the water. We'll look at some of the common land uses and how they impact stormwater runoff, flooding, and other watershed issues, and consider planning tools such as stormwater regulations, zoning ordinances, and land use law, as well as comprehensive planning. There are many land uses throughout our watershed, including impervious surfaces created by development, wetlands, forests, and waterways, and agricultural land. These have varying effects on our watershed. For example, the different surfaces change the degree to which runoff is absorbed or how excessive pollutants get into our waterways. The first land use mentioned, impervious surface, is caused by development. This could be development of a town center with expansive parking lots to accommodate shoppers, or types of residential development, single-family homes or cluster development commonly called subdivisions. A common misconception is that developed land is more beneficial to a town because of its tax revenue. However, nearly all cost of community service studies, which examine tax revenues generated by different land uses and the costs to local government providing services to those uses, show that residential land is a net drain on local governments. Farm and forested land require fewer community services and help towns maintain lower property taxes. There are a variety of planning tools to consider that help manage or mitigate stormwater runoff, flooding, and erosion. These include comprehensive planning, zoning ordinances, and conservation programs. It is important to note that stormwater is regulated in designated urbanized areas. Stormwater is a source of water pollution, and the EPA's Stormwater Phase 2 rule requires municipalities and regulated areas to plan and implement actions to reduce pollution from stormwater. Municipalities are required to approve and implement a stormwater prevention plan. Every municipality should have a stormwater officer who is responsible for overseeing implementation and reporting. In Western New York, the Western New York Stormwater Coalition supports regulated municipalities in Niagara and Erie counties in meeting New York State requirements and reducing stormwater pollution. When discussing water-related issues in the town of Boston, Supervisor Jason Keating identified a few that we've seen in various towns in our watershed.
Drainage, hands down, for the town of Boston is and probably will be, for the foreseeable future, the biggest hot topic that is out there. Let's face it, non-political comments here, everything aside, the 100-year floodplains that were there, and let's face it, the maps that are out there, they're from the from Army Corps of Engineers. Nothing against them, but the reality is these maps are from the 70s or the 80s. They have not been updated in decades. In today's world, today's climate, call it what you want, climate change, global warming, whatever people want, whatever adjective or descriptive term they want to give to it. The reality is that these floods and the rains are not what they were just even 10 years ago.
Flooding is a common issue across most of our subwatersheds. Some of it is due to development and increased paved, impervious surfaces where water is no longer absorbed, compounded with increased precipitation in the region. In others, it's from erosion causing log jams or from ice jams forming.
The water is an issue, and part of that is due to the fact of the 219 splitting the town of Boston right down the middle. And anyone that is in relatively close proximity to the 219, there's been quite a few complaints about the amount of salinity because of the road salt that's placed on the roads, which is obviously becoming a hot topic. The New York State Association of Highway Superintendents has covered this quite extensively in trying to look at a way to reduce the amount of salt that goes on our roads. The second complaint is the amount of sulfur and or high mineral content. And so that is something that people said that once the 219 did go through, that they saw that the quality of their well water literally changed just about overnight. So we're working on it's called the Drainage Improvement Plan and Drainage Improvement Area. That's something that we've partnered with our town engineer, and they're going to be going and assessing all of the outfalls. They're going to be assessing our MS4 district. They're going to be assessing all of the tributaries to the 18 Mile Creek bed, as well as any of the ravines that are throughout the community that have been here for many years. Because as development has happened and new homes have come into the area, of course, the water flow coming off of the hills has increased, thus impacting the water level and volume, the sheer volume of water coming through 18 Mile Creek. So that is hopefully it will all be in the plan as well.
While stormwater regulations help guide actions in more urbanized or developed areas, there are planning tools that can be used by any municipality, whether rural, suburban, or urban. Another key planning tool is zoning ordinances. These codify the vision for what a community wants itself to look like by placing limitations on how specific land can be used. By having enforceable regulations for building and use of space, natural resources can be protected from decisions made on privately owned property. Zoning commonly employed for the protection of water resources includes establishing open spaces in conservation districts, special use districts, buffer areas limiting development near a water body, and restrictions on the allowable amount of impervious surface in a zone. Zoning can also be used to drive development to specifically identified geographies in the town. This helps create focused clusters of development, preventing open land from being developed. This is what we call smart growth, which has a variety of benefits, including protecting our water resources.
The prime soils in Holland, they're all important soils. A lot of the soils are classified as important soils for their farming, and a lot of dairy lands up on the hills, but the prime soil for agriculture is in the valley along Route 16, which unfortunately is also the prime area for new development. They're putting a new plaza in where some of our prime soils are. Trying to balance landowners' wants and needs to what's best for the town is a challenge for the planning board and town board. Can't really tell the landowners what to do with their property, but we also want to encourage them to keep it as agricultural as possible. It's a big resource for the town of Holland.
Another planning tool is zoning codes. Zoning codes allow land uses and types of construction based on a zone type. Zoning requirements can include, but are not limited to, provisions detailing building sizes, setback requirements, or how far a building must be from the edge of a parcel line, allowable amounts of impervious surface, or it can be zoned for a specific land use such as agricultural land.
We do have some of the most protected soils. We do have prime soil. Some of the best soils in the United States reside in the town of Eden, and those are well protected as well through ordinances, as well as agricultural districting and agricultural zoning.
Overlay districts apply an additional layer of criteria and requirements to a geographic area. For example, a conservation overlay district would add regulations to an area on top of those for the existing zone. This is done in recognition of special circumstances in a specific geographic area, such as the presence of a creek or prime agricultural land. Creating an overlay district is accomplished by writing and approving an amendment to local zoning ordinances establishing the boundaries, purpose, and protections. The process of updating zoning laws can seem daunting, but luckily there are resources available such as model ordinances developed by New York State Department of State or neighboring towns.
So some of the struggles that we have in a town that's really concentrated in agriculture is a good balance in between supporting and increasing your population to be able to support systems like the school, to help with your tax revenue base. What we've been able to do in Eden, I think, is extraordinary, where we've been able to maintain that balance and still look forward to the future. Through our comprehensive plan update, we are looking at as I mentioned before, removing rural residential out of our zoning and increasing our agricultural as well as our suburban in order to accomplish both goals and even out that balance, where we'll still be able to heavily support agriculture and increase that protection of agricultural and resources there, as well as increase our suburban by doing cluster development so that we can continue to support our school system and our tax base.
By having residential zoning areas and clustering development, it's easier and less costly for the town to ensure sewer and water infrastructure is done properly, and also that there's adequate planning to balance drainage with impervious surface. It concentrates the effects of development, providing less of a threat to farmland, forests, open space, and wetlands. For example, one opportunity in cluster development is to require green infrastructure in your land use and zoning ordinances. Comprehensive plans are an important component in this process. They reflect community values and desires and create a roadmap to implement codes and programs that will meet those goals.
We just recently redid our comprehensive plan, and there we addressed how we would do development, whether it be in certain development zones. We also considered implementing an overdraft, so overlay of zoning for the wellhead protection. Not only where the wells themselves are located, but that aquifer is fed from certain zones in Holland, and outside of Holland they're kind of out of our control. Glacial moraines up here on the hill can feed up to 30% of the water that goes into that aquifer. So protecting those zones as well is a concern. That's a very rural area, and again, you're balancing the landowners' wants and needs and to what's best for the water quality of the towns.
Another option is putting land aside for conservation through acquisition or easements. Conserving land maintains natural systems and allows for water to be absorbed and filtered, providing habitat. According to the EPA, it is also proven to provide avoided costs downstream because of the filtration it provides. Land can be conserved by the town itself or by working with a land trust to protect valuable land in your community. New York State has a handful of funding programs to support land conservation.
Yeah, and also doing some agricultural zoning implementation as far as maybe some incentives for the farmers to keep it as working with the Land Conservancy and such, and encouraging that. So.
Looking forward, most towns throughout our watershed, if they haven't started to already, are going to have to consider a combination of water-related solutions.
The example I use and I bring to the table, look at our look at our country down south. The flooding, they're investing in their infrastructure, they're investing in how to handle water. That's exactly what we need to do here. We've had many years that we have not had to do this in I'll call it the Northeast, but I think it's, time is of the essence. If we don't start taking care of things now, yes, people's basements will continue to flood, we'll continue to have washouts, we'll continue to have erosion, all these other problems, and ultimately that does fall on government, whether it's local government, county government, or state for that matter. So, and infrastructure is going to be a big topic of discussion. That's my prediction for quite some time to come.
Whatever the case, when looking for solutions, there isn't a one-size-fits-all option. Depending on the size or source of the issue, some solutions may be larger in scale or more costly than others. A lot of the time, the town isn't the only party involved. It takes working across town lines with county and state level government to get things done.
The town doesn't have a lot to work with. They have to be running on a tight budget, so working with the town, with the other institutions like the Soil and Water Conservation and LUPA and Erie County Water Quality Committee allows us to get some grant money to do these projects properly and keep some of the issues from becoming an issue in the future. Controlling erosion, doing the ditches correctly is one example.
One of the benefits I can say here in Erie County that we have is it's called the Association of Erie County Governments, and all of us supervisors, we're a bipartisan group, and we all work very well together. There's many of us that see eye to eye on a lot of key issues, especially because it affects our municipalities, and we certainly know that there are the associated costs with some of these projects.
those watersheds don't know a political boundary. Where we share a watershed with Niagara County or Wyoming County or Cattaraugus or Chautauqua County, then from a municipal perspective, you might have 9 or 10 or 11 different municipalities that are all within one specific watershed. So what we also try to do is, as those folks are stakeholders, the upper watershed might be dealing with issues such as erosion and debris in the streams. Well, where does that debris end up? That debris ends up downstream, which might be causing localized flooding for downstream municipalities. So there's a few organizations and a few entities out there. One in particular, the Water Quality Coordinating Committee, is a group of folks that meets every other month to discuss water quality issues. And it's really a forum for one municipality to talk about issues and concerns with another municipality, and have other environmental or conservation related folks there to give guidance or to try to focus areas of concern and try to address issues of similar concern.
Thank you for attending What is a Watershed? We hope that you came away with a better understanding of what a watershed is and how your community's actions impact our water resources. As you reflect on the presentation, please don't hesitate to reach out to any of the organizations listed if you have any questions about the presentation, issues, or ideas for future projects.